today we're going to talk about evangelical Christians. We're going to talk about whatever crossroads they feel they may be at in terms of their support of President Trump. First of all, let me just blather for about 90 seconds. You'd love that, right, if I blathered? So evangelical is a term that's very elastic and also very muddy. It's a term that gets defined a lot of different ways. And there are people who think of themselves as evangelicals who don't think of other people who think of themselves as evangelicals, if you follow that. I think you could say, first of all, that the demographic term definition of evangelicals or demographic understanding of evangelicals is probably a little bit different from the theological understanding. Let me do the theological understanding as best I can. Once again, there's lots of ways to, I was going to say to skin this cat, but that doesn't sound very nice. There's a lot of ways to understand this. But I think if you look for a consistent thread, there'd be kind of two. One of them would be a very heavy reliance on the Bible as a sole source of authority. There's even a term, sola scriptorum, and this is where you go to get your answers. And then there's the notion of a personal decision to accept Christ as Savior. It doesn't come from somebody else, it comes from you. It's, in fact, something that you decide to do. Both of those things are there as fairly consistent elements in everything that we think of as the evangelical movement. But after that, there's quite a bit of diversity there. But over the years, evangelical Christians, and, we have to say also the movement goes back to certainly the late 18th century, maybe even the late 17th century, the revivals of George Whitefield and people like that. It's been around for a long time. But in modernity, evangelical Christianity and conservative politics have formed an alliance, have become heavily associated with one another. Not a perfect Venn diagram overlap, but heavily associated with one another. And during the last election, although evangelicals had other Republican candidates that they liked a lot, people like Ted Cruz and Rick Santorum, they ultimately lined up behind Donald Trump. And therein lies, obviously, a conundrum, because there are many ways in which the behavior of Donald Trump does not comport with evangelical Christianity. Proverbs 16:32 says basically that he that ruleth his spirit is superior to he that taketh a city. And Donald Trump does not rule his spirit very well. He does not control himself very well in lots of ways. So what are they going to do about that? That's one of the things we'll be talking about today. Joining us right now is Sarah McCammon. Sarah McCammon is a reporter for NPR. You know her voice very well. Sarah McCammon covers the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast, and she was also NPR's lead political reporter assigned to the Donald Trump campaign during the 2016 election. She also has a life background in this church to a certain degree, and therefore some extra perspective on all this. So, Sarah McCammon, first of all, welcome to our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So maybe you can just quickly trace kind of how this has gone. During the campaign, there were certainly moments, whether it's the Access Hollywood tape or some of the other things, or just what even was latently known about the thrice married Donald Trump, and that might have given the evangelical movement pause. So at least formally and openly, how did they deal with those kinds of conflicts?
Yeah, I would go back actually many months before the Access Hollywood video, which, as you know, was released in October of 2016, just weeks before the election. If you think back to the Republican primary, when there were something like 17 major candidates, by depending on what your criteria is for a major candidate, there were like 17 in the Republican primary, and a lot of them, on the face of it, would have seemed like a much more likely match for evangelicals, and a lot of evangelicals, publicly and privately, as you noted, were backing people like Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, or Dr. Ben Carson, or even Florida Senator Marco Rubio was a popular choice for a lot of evangelicals. Donald Trump wasn't high on a lot of people's list, you would have thought, for the reasons you just outlined, and yet he was consistently near or at the top of the polls throughout the Republican primary. Of course, wound up becoming the nominee. And I think one of the big questions even back that far was, well, how does this work? Well, how can Donald Trump be, doing so well, and when evangelicals are such an important constituency in the Republican base? And there are a lot of reasons for that, and I would point out that there was a huge pool of candidates, and if you were an evangelical voter who's mostly motivated by things like abortion, religious freedom, maybe still same-sex marriage, there were a lot of other options besides Donald Trump. And to my, as I watched that primary, it seemed like it was hard for any one sort of lane within the GOP to coalesce, and Donald Trump just kind of rocketed to the top. So what evangelicals were left with was essentially a choice between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And for many, many evangelicals, 81%, according to exit polling, it wasn't that hard of a decision. Donald Trump seemed like a better bet, despite whatever misgivings many of them did and do have.
Right. And so now there are new things. I mean, Stormy Daniels is probably the newest of new things, but evangelicals tend to, skew pretty patriotic. So the notion of Russian interference with the election is also probably not going to sit all that well with them. Some of the other investigations into economic corruption might be a problem. So they need to keep having conversations with President Trump, make sure he's still the guy that they hoped that he was, or a guy that they can live with anyway. So how have these conversations gone so far?
Well, I know that, first of all, evangelical leaders, and as you say, evangelical means a lot of things. There are a lot of different kinds of people who identify as evangelical in different ways, and there is the theological and the political definition. But accepting all of those caveats, President Trump meets frequently with small and large groups of evangelicals. He, speaks at evangelical events. He has evangelical leaders in his office on a regular basis. Sometimes those meetings are publicized, some of them are not. But many of the evangelicals I talk to have said that they feel that they have, much better access to this president than they've ever had with, even other Republican presidents. And by and large, many of them are very happy with the policy, with his policies and on issues like abortion and religious freedom. And so that's true on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there are still many concerns about his sort of temperament, his personality, his penchant for sort of talking off the cuff and divisive rhetoric, and of course his personal life. But one thing I hear over and over from evangelicals I talk to is, look, we knew this about him going into the election, the Access Hollywood video. We knew who Donald Trump was. None of this is any surprise. The Stormy Daniels scandal, that he has denied having an affair with her. And so they're really focused on policy. And I know that there are, you saw some of my reporting, there are evangelicals who would like to meet with President Trump this summer, really primarily in an effort to rally the base, because I think there are concerns heading into the midterms on a lot of different levels. The president has had, low favorability ratings, although those seem to be creeping back up. There's a lot of Democratic energy, so there's concern among conservatives and Republicans about what that means for their voters this fall. And so the idea would be to meet with the president, talk about policy goals, and talk about turning out the base, and especially the evangelical base, which is going to be an important one for Republicans this fall.
Right. So you've reported on a potential meeting scheduled for June 19th at where else? The Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. The phrase "come to Jesus" meeting is kind of thrown around a lot these days as in a very sort of analogy-driven way. This would probably literally be a come to Jesus meeting if they have it, and this would be the conversation you're talking about, right?
Right. Well, and this is, and I should say, this is something that's being talked about. That I know I've heard from multiple sources that the president's been invited, and the White House has expressed interest. It hasn't been confirmed yet, but I think there is wide agreement among a lot of evangelical leaders that, especially given the stakes this fall with the midterms, that getting a bunch of influential evangelicals in the same room, getting them together with the president to talk about strategy, to talk about the future, would be a good idea. And yes, these conversations are happening at a time when Stormy Daniels is on a lot of people's minds, and when there's just a lot going on in Washington policy-wise, and again, when there's concern about what 2018 will mean in terms of voter turnout, and for some of these policy accomplishments that a lot of, and I should say we're talking about white evangelicals primarily. I don't think we've said that yet, but
right.
Conservative, primarily white evangelicals who supported Trump, do feel that he's delivered on a lot of their agenda, and they don't want to lose that. They don't want to see that eroded in 2018.
White evangelicals and Trump voters have very similar kinds of demographics. And you, as I don't know how old you are. I think you just told me during before the show when I was noisily singing.
I am 37. Okay. I'm literally as old as you can be and be considered a millennial.
Right. And so your generation, they're losing your generation. The demographic trend lines are, I think in 87, I'm doing this off the top of my head, I think 46% of evangelicals were over 50 years old. In 2016, according to Pew, 62% of evangelicals were over 50 years old. So they're losing the younger part of the demographic. And I would imagine not that evangelical leaders make decisions on demographics. I mean, presumably they make decisions on faith, on scripture, on what they believe is right. But it's got to be a concern, just in the way that the Trump voting base also skews kind of old. Everything about this kind of points in a direction of less and less relevance. And I guess maybe let me just segue from that and just say, they just saw an election where there were some problems reconciling notions of morality with evangelical Christianity, and that was Roy Moore. That was in Alabama. Was that any kind of particular political lesson to evangelical Christians based on your reporting?
I'm not sure specifically about that one, but I think to your larger point, because I haven't done a lot of reporting myself on Alabama, I can only tell you what I've read from other people. But to your larger point about the demographic shift, I think one big concern for white evangelicals is that right now, they have a lot of power. They have a lot of access to the White House. They arguably put Trump in office, or he couldn't have gotten there without them. But you're right, the white evangelicalism is not where the growth is in the church. There's been a lot of really good polling on this by the Public Religion Research Institute. They've looked at this pretty closely, and really the growth in evangelicalism is in the Latino church, and the African American church is holding steady. But those groups have very different political priorities than white evangelicals do, and there's a huge shift away from the church among young white evangelicals. Those under 30, I believe it's in the single digits. I'd have to double check that, but I was just talking to a pollster about this week, and the numbers are staggering. Are slipping in staggering ways. So if you're talking about evangelicalism as a theology, there is still a lot of energy there and a lot of strength, especially in among churches of color, primarily people of color. But white evangelicalism over time is unlikely to remain the powerhouse that it has been. And so yes, if your policy goals align with those of white evangelical leaders, I would say there would be cause for concern going forward.
And presumably, I'm just doing this is the level of guesswork now. If you want to speak to young people who've grown up in evangelical churches, they may have a shifting set of attitudes about things like gay marriage, climate change, economic justice. Some of these things may be uppermost in their mind in a way that they weren't in. The baby boom bulge, which is a huge part of the existing evangelical demographic, would probably have seen those issues in different terms.
For sure, and there is polling that backs this up. Pew did I believe released some data last year that showed that, especially on issues like same-sex marriage, younger evangelicals were far more supportive of same-sex marriage than baby boomer evangelicals. And even on the issue of abortion, which had been one that some Pew polling had suggested was holding pretty steady from the older to younger generation. Again, PRRI just released some data looking, not just at evangelicals, but broadly, younger people were more likely, in a poll just released this week, more likely to shift their position on abortion than older people. And when they did shift their position, were more likely to shift in favor of supporting abortion rights. And again, the pollster I talked to on this one said, that may be, at least perhaps in large part, due to the declining religiosity of the younger generation, because particularly with the issue of abortion, there's a huge overlap between evangelicals and opposition to abortion rights. You have the younger generation becoming less and less religious, less and less evangelical, and you're also seeing a shift in their views on that issue. And just anecdotally, younger evangelicals that I know often are very concerned about things like social justice, about refugees, about what's happening outside of the U.S. borders. In a way, in a way that seems different than the older generation. So yeah, I think you're seeing a priority shift there as well as a demographic shift.
Well, Sarah McCammon, it's been a great privilege to have you on the show, and I'm a big fan. NPR reporter covering the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast, also NPR's lead political reporter assigned to the Trump campaign during 2016. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much.
All right, that was Sarah McCammon. I'm going to take a break. We're going to take a break, not a long break. We will be back. All right, so we're back. We're talking about the evangelical movement and specifically its relationship with Donald Trump. Now, this is sort of a puzzlement to a lot of people outside the evangelical movement who look at this and knowing whatever it is that they know or think that they know, they say, how can this be? How can evangelicals, believing what they believe, choose to support Donald Trump? Well, conveniently, we have with us Stephen Mansfield, speaker and New York Times bestselling author of several books, including, are you ready? Choosing Donald Trump, God, Anger, Hope, and Why Christian Conservatives Supported Him. So we're going to get an answer. So Stephen Mansfield, welcome to our conversation. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. I titled that book just for you.
Yeah, I know. It's made to order for this conversation. Well, okay, it's a very broad question, which has, I think, a more detailed and nuanced answer. But I think it's one that obviously you felt compelled to look for an answer for. As Sarah McCammon was just saying, during 2015 and 2016, evangelicals essentially knew who they were getting. They didn't know the name Stormy Daniels, but they knew that he'd been married 3 times and that his sex life had been, on the cover of New York tabloids. They knew that this guy maybe wasn't clean as a whistle. So why did they look past that?
Well, they looked past it, and Sarah's exactly right. They looked past it largely because if you go back to the 2016 presidential election, the frank truth is evangelicals felt bombarded by 8 years of the Obama administration and terrified of another 8 years of Hillary Clinton. If you're an evangelical, you were offended by the Obama administration's strong pro-abortion stand. You were offended by their advocacy for LGBT issues. You were disturbed deeply, if not traumatized, by the Obama Justice Department filing lawsuits, pressuring organizations like Hobby Lobby regarding their employee insurance, to include abortifacients and what have you. All of this came down heavily, and then, of course, with what was perceived as a soft stance on Islam, all of these are the issues that evangelicals cited. And then, of course, when they looked at Hillary Clinton, they thought that worse was coming. They weren't deceived about who Donald Trump was. I mean, this is a man who had once defended adultery in the headlines of New York newspapers. I mean, they weren't fooled. But they are committed to their core values. Some of the things I've just listed are those core values, and they weren't going to be shaken from it just because Donald Trump is a rough customer.
One thing that you've pointed out, I think it's a point worth making and a point with which I have lived through and live with, is that evangelicals are not a monolithic block. I attend, though I haven't been in a while, but it's time to go back. I attend a self-described evangelical church in which 2 of the 3 pastors are gay or lesbian. It's politics, its attitudes are very different from the typical picture of evangelicals. It's a pretty rara avis, but it's at least fair to say that the evangelical movement isn't just one thing. It's a bunch of things.
That's exactly correct. I can attest to that myself. I split my year with my wife between Nashville and D.C. In D.C., we tend about a 4,000-member, largely African-American congregation, and in Nashville, we attend kind of a young, happening Anglican church. Both would be considered evangelical, and the diversity is unbelievable. You can walk through the parking lot of the African-American church in D.C., and see half the stickers are for Hillary and half the stickers are for Trump, and yet those people are going to be inside, in a typical rock and African American church. And so you're right, far more diverse. In fact, one of the issues that's going on right now is, we accurately report that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, but evangelicals of color, of course, went a completely different direction and are offended by their white evangelical fellows who didn't seem to care that race was an offending issue. And so these are some of the fault lines within evangelicalism themselves.
Right. So if we look back at those white evangelicals, another part of this is, if you look at the demographic of a Trump voter, it's often kind of similar to one of the prevalent, maybe the prevalent set of demographics for modern evangelicals: over 55, holding a high school diploma or less, a third generation or more American citizen, making $50,000 a year or less. I'm describing two things: one of the big bulges of Trump voters and the way the white evangelical movement is skewing right now. In a way, it's not terribly surprising they would line up together.
No, it's not. It's absolutely not. And I think this explains both the surprises and the things that weren't that surprising about the 2016 election. But I heard your interview with Sarah, and I couldn't agree more that overall the important demographic, the important trends, are against conventional conservative mainline evangelicalism. There is going to be a racial upheaval. There is going to be a dramatic theological shift. I'm not even sure the word evangelical can be used anymore in the sense that it refers to anything singular and monolithic. But we're definitely undergoing a change, and I think this recent election is going to accelerate all of that.
Right. And in fact, evangelical participation in America, it's undulated over the decades and centuries. It hasn't been a straight line going up or down. But starting in the 1970s, I was writing a lot about religion. There was this guy, Dean Kelly, who had this famous book out. I think it was called Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, something like that. But that was the trend line right then. It's a little bit different right now. And one thing that I wonder about, Stephen, is the rhetoric that Donald Trump used about elites may have resonated very well with evangelicals who do feel scorned by elites. Not every evangelical, as we keep saying, they're not all the same. But those evangelicals that I've described, who live in the middle of the country, not on one of the coasts, and have subscribed to a certain set of values, they probably do feel scorned by the elites that Trump was at least explicitly rejecting.
Well, it's a real oddity, I have to tell you, because yes, there's no question that the lambasting of elites resonates with evangelicals. At the same time, evangelicals, they may not be in the top 1%, they're certainly in the top 10% for the most part. Most evangelical churches are suburban. Evangelicals tend to be well off. There aren't comprehensive surveys on this, but maybe it's anecdotal. But they tend to be well off. That they are not among the downtrodden. They are certainly not among the least prosperous 10 to 20% for the most part. And so it's interesting how Trump's lambasting, by the way, of a socioeconomic class he was part of, resonated so well with them, but it certainly did. And I think, again, this goes not so much to a socioeconomic commentary, but more to a religious commentary. Evangelicals do feel beleaguered in America when it comes to their faith. They do feel under attack, even though economically they are not at all.
Right. I think it has more to do.
Anyway.
Yeah, it has to do with more mainstream social and political culture. It's the same language that Jerry Falwell used when he founded the Moral Majority.
Yes.
He basically said there's an entire country that consists of us, and there's a culture that essentially is not of us. What's wrong with this picture?
And millionaires would feel persecuted at that moment, because again, not because of an economic issue, but because of how they felt their faith was being treated in the broader culture.
I guess one question that maybe we should save it for the third segment, but I'll ask it now. Some of Sarah's reporting has indicated that evangelicals are getting a little jumpy about the 2018 midterms and the 2020 election, and there may be some of them who are wondering how long they should stick around with Trump. I don't know. Does that fit your understanding?
It does. There's a certain amount of buyer's remorse, maybe 5 to 10%. But the bottom line is evangelicals are not going to abandon those core values that I mentioned at the top of our time together. They are going to be committed to a pro-life position. They're going to be insisting upon religious liberty. They're going to be suspicious of a LGBT agenda. And so they will vote again for a Donald Trump or a Trump clone at the more local level if their issues are embattled. They will vote for the person who holds those issues, even if that person is as raw as Donald Trump. So I don't see as much movement. I think what's going to be a bigger factor is the mobilization of the left. I think Democrats are mobilized. I think undecideds or independents are moving more leftward, and I think we've seen that trend already in some of the elections that are sort of bellwether elections around the country.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break. We're talking to Stephen Mansfield. His book is Choosing Donald Trump: God, Anger, Hope, and Why Christian Conservatives Supported Him. We're going to take a quick break. Here's a little song that we wrote yesterday. Well, Jim Chapdelaine wrote it, and then Kate Callahan and I tried to sing it with him. It's a song about why you should donate to WNPR and to public radio. People are going to ask you to do that right now, and we urge you. Do I have to keep talking for a while? No, you got okay. So I wasn't sure how long the song was. Here it goes.
2, 3, 4. Coming up's a number, you should call it. First go find your credit card or wallet. Make sure you pull over if you're driving in a car. It's a perfect time to donate to WNPR.
President Trump had to fire both Scaramucci and Bannon after Scaramucci described that thing Bannon did to pleasure himself. Not only is that forbidden in the Old Testament, it's not even a legal yoga pose. Today's show was produced by Pastor Josh Nalea and me, Kyone Wolf, with help from our intern Garnet McLaughlin. Amanda Fish is currently engaged to Meatloaf. Together they want to have lots of little loaves and fishes. Boom. The part of Bill Curry was played by Morty Vincent Peale. On tomorrow's show, what do we mean by the phrases too old or too young? And now, back to Colin.
And we've been talking on this show, and we'll continue to talk about the relationship, first of all, about evangelical Christians in America, how they feel about the political system in general, and then how that political system and those feelings led them up to the doorstep of now President Donald Trump. With us for this conversation ever since last, I'm scrolling down to the IDs here. Hold on for a second. Ever since the last segment is Stephen Mansfield. His book is Choosing Donald Trump: God, Anger, Hope, and Why Christian Conservatives Supported Him. Now joining us also is Bob Vanderplatz, evangelical leader, speaker, and political activist. He is currently the president and CEO of the Family Leader, a social conservative organization, and he is the author of If 714, an urgent call for revival, it's time. First of all, Bob Vanderplatz, welcome to our conversation.
Oh, thrilled to be with you guys.
Let's just start with your relationship with Donald Trump, the candidate. It was actually kind of a rocky one for a while, right? You were a Ted Cruz supporter, and things didn't always go all that well.
Well, Donald Trump and I have been friends for about 6-7 years, and things went splendidly until I endorsed Ted Cruz. And even then, things went really well for a while until Ted Cruz started to inch up in the polls in Iowa. And that's when he and I had a very high-profile Twitter spat, Twitter war. It's one that I like to remind him that I won. And the Washington Post, the Des Moines Register, the New York Times all had my back at the same time. But even after Mr. Trump received the nomination, he was very gracious. He had me in his office. We met one-on-one for 45 minutes and had a great visit. And so what I told him then and what I tell him today is I am a friend to him. And what that means is when he does things that are right, I'm going to cheer him on. And when he goes outside the bounds, which I heard a little play about Scaramucci, I'm going to hold him to account. So when Scaramucci happened, I went exceptionally high profile, very public about you had to fire Scaramucci. You got to get rid of this out of your administration. I think that's what a friend is. A real friend is you cheer and you hold to account.
I want to talk to both you and Stephen Mansfield a little bit about one of the things that I think does did differentiate the Trump campaign from, say, the Cruz campaign, and something that may have spoken very powerfully to evangelicals. And that is, I'm going to call it, just for operational purposes, a kind of tear it all down, burn it all down message. I mean, that was very much where Steve Bannon was as he was behind Donald Trump. I mean, I think of songs that get sung in the church that I attend. There's one that says, "Go set your church on fire, win this nation back, change the atmosphere, build your kingdom here." Bob, I'm going to start with you. There is something of a message that we often hear within evangelical Christianity, that the system, the world that we're living in, is morally compromised and crippled to the point that radical change is needed. I'm wondering if that's one reason that ultimately evangelicals were able to get behind Donald Trump.
Well, I think the main reason evangelicals got behind Donald Trump was Hillary Clinton. I think that's what galvanized them around Trump. But I do agree with your premise, is that we as evangelicals, not only we as evangelicals, we as American citizens, were very tired with politics as usual. And we knew that a drastic change had to occur. And that's quite frankly why a guy like Mike Huckabee didn't get more traction. Because Mike Huckabee's a really good, nice gentleman. They did view Cruz, though, as somebody that could disrupt and cause disruption in D.C., and they saw Trump, who could take that to an exponential factor. So I think evangelicals, Americans as a whole, were like, we do not want status quo. We don't want politics as usual. We've been down that road way too many times before. Even if we're taking a chance, we're willing to take a chance because we know something needs to change.
So I'm going to have both of you react to this. I'll have Stephen Mansfield react when we come back from it. Here is a little montage of Donald Trump trying to talk about his own relationship to Christianity.
The Art of the Deal, great book. The Bible, even better. Why is that for you?
There's so many things, like, you take whatever you want to say. There's so many things that you could learn from it, and it's an incredible book.
2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17. That's the whole ball game.
Do you actively go to church, or is that something that it's more just when you can?
Right. Well, I go as much as I can, always on Christmas, always on Easter, and during the Sundays.
Have you ever asked God for forgiveness?
That's a tough question. I don't think in terms of I'm a religious person, and I go to church, and I love God, and I love my church.
But have you ever asked God for forgiveness?
I'm not sure I have. I just go and try and do a better job from there. I don't think so.
All right. So, Stephen Mansfield, I'll let you begin. What do you hear? I know what a lot of Ted Cruz supporters heard in some of those lines, but Stephen Mansfield, what do you hear?
Well, that's one of the worst presentations of religion by an American presidential candidate in all of our history. I mean, whether you're pro-Donald Trump or not, no one believes he's articulate when it comes to religion. And so it's absolutely stunning. Again, you almost want to give credit to the evangelicals for being able to look beyond this complete bumbling of almost any religious theme in the campaign. And I don't think there's any way we can back away from it. It's just the worst we've seen. Even the times that George W. Bush bobbled the ball when it came to religious questions is not near as bad as what Donald Trump did.
Well, Bob, when you were over in the Cruz camp, obviously 2 Corinthians is the beginning of a joke, right? 2 Corinthians walk into a bar. 2 Corinthians would be how an evangelical Christian would begin to describe that citation. There was a certain amount of mirth over on the Cruz side, right?
Oh, sure there was. The last clip that you played about asking God for forgiveness, that's actually Frank Luntz asking then candidate Trump on the stage that I provided Mr. Trump at our Family Leadership Summit. And when he basically dropped the ball on that question and said, I don't think I have, I honestly thought, this is game over. I mean, his campaign is done, especially with who he needs to win over in a Republican primary. And so when people say Mr. Trump is on a faith journey or President Trump is on a faith journey, I totally agree with that. And what I'd say, it is the very beginning of a faith journey. As a matter of fact, the last time I met with Mr. Trump one-on-one after he secured the nomination, we walked through things. And he took, I know, to his credit, he took notes on it of Exodus 18:21 about why we need a Lincoln today versus a Reagan who would lead our country to repentance. What does it mean to not only have Jesus as Savior of your life, but what does it mean to make Jesus the Lord of your life? So, yes, he is on a faith journey. That's why I believe he needs exceptionally wise counsel around him who's willing to speak truth to him, even when that truth is unpleasant or unwanted by the president's ears.
So, Bob, one of the things that he had trouble answering was what was his favorite Bible verse. I'm assuming, based on the conversations you're having with him now, he could come up with something now?
I'm not sure he would. Mm-hmm. And because I personally, and I don't mean this as any kind of a diss on President Trump, I don't think he probably has a favorite Bible verse yet. And I think the one thing that came across out of that is that at least he was authentic in that versus I'm trying to play like, okay, I really like Matthew 6:33, and here's what it says, and here he was just kind of being, that's kind of who he is. So I think what it is, again, have wise faith counsel around him that can walk him through the scriptures and let him glean the understanding and the benefit and the blessing of the scriptures.
I was kind of hoping he'd go for Matthew 6:21 instead.
There you go.
For those who are listening, that's where your treasure is, there also shall your heart be. So, one thing that I want to ask both of you, Stephen, I'll start with you. I think for reasons that you've articulated very forcefully, there were ways in which it would be impossible for evangelicals, even in a state of dissatisfaction with Donald Trump, to turn to Hillary Clinton. And a lot of these had to do with things that they'd perceived in the Obama administration and particularly attitudes towards reproductive rights, things like that. I'm wondering I'm asking you to do some wild guesswork right now. I don't think there's any polling on this. What they would have thought about Bernie Sanders, whether they would have perceived Bernie Sanders differently. There's so much that's in the Gospels that is about economic justice of the kind. Acts, the beginning of Acts, it sounds like a Bernie Sanders campaign speech talking about, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Do you think there were evangelicals who could resonate to the words of a kind of socialist Jewish atheist?
Very few. This is actually one of my concerns when it comes to evangelicals. I share many evangelical core values, no question. I am an evangelical. I don't hesitate to say that. At the same time, evangelicals have not really embraced the social justice side of the biblical worldview of Scripture. And so they're pretty much their frontline issues are the ones we've identified: reproductive rights, LGBT, religious liberty in general, certainly as that plays to a Justice Department. These are the core issues: strong defense, perhaps a strong stand against Islam. This is where most evangelicals are now. They're missing, of course, and I think many evangelicals would share this at least in theory. They're missing the social teachings of the prophets of the Old Testament. They're missing many of the teachings of Jesus when it comes to social justice. But their bedrock issues are the ones that have defined politically active evangelicalism, the sort of religious right that remains for a long time. And I don't think most of them are really able to get past that at this point. And that was the defining factor. They weren't looking to Donald Trump to be a social justice, prophet or purveyor, or to promise social change and justice. They were looking for Donald Trump to bring change. He was as angry and as raw as they are, and they had their 4 or 5 issues, and he promised service in those areas, and that was the core of the whole matter for them.
Bob Vanderplaats, I don't want to intrude on your pastoral counseling of Donald Trump, but in Acts, there's a lesson about what to do when you sell your real estate. Sure. Ananias and Sapphira.
Didn't turn out well, did it?
Didn't turn out well because they sold their real estate. They only gave part of it to the apostles, and they lied about it. So I don't know. Can economic justice be part of the evangelical message out in the political sphere?
Oh, sure it can. And first of all, I think when you go back to that situation at the beginning of Acts, the real sin there was that they lied. They tried to deceive God, like, I'm giving you everything, but I'm really not. I'm holding some back for myself. That, I think, was, at that point, then was the deadly sin. What I would say for evangelicals in this 2016 election, I think it's very simple. You had a Supreme Court vacancy, and that was the one thing that they focused on. All the other stuff was, quite frankly, a gamble with Donald Trump. They didn't know where he would be on a lot of issues. Matter of fact, his record and his rhetoric was definitely checkered or, quite frankly, on the wrong side of a lot of issues. But I think the very point there is that it's not about just being pro-life, but what do you do for that child when that child's outside of the womb? How do you come alongside that mom, the dad, the child? I think that's a comprehensive message and needs to be a comprehensive message for the evangelical church.
Right. Amen. Hey, Bob, I'm going to have to stop there because I'm running into the end of the show. But also, that's a great way to end. I think that's an important message at the end. Bob Vanderplaat, evangelical leader, speaker, political activist, currently the president of CEO and CEO of the Family Leader. Stephen Mansfield, his book is Choosing Donald Trump: God, Anger, Hope, and Why Christian Conservatives Supported Him. We have to go now, but once again, we are asking you to support this radio station, and if you like shows like the one that you just heard, please do consider answering the call right now when people ask you.
Conspiracy-minded protesters of corporate greed. We who have nothing and most likely will till we all end up locked up in jails by conservative Christian, right-wing Republican, straight white American.